I can't see you if
Yeah.
I can't see you. If we can't sit down together and break bread and talk, where's your humanity? Can I see your humanity? Can I show you my humanity? Can I show you where I hurt? Can I show you where I have joy? Can you show me the same? It's just that simple. Sit down and tell the
Yeah.
truth.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on the Reframe to Reform podcast. Our mission is to have the difficult conversations about how we can reframe the way society thinks about those who have been justice involved. We know change is possible, and above all else, people do not lose their innate worth once they have been behind bars. I am your host, Callie, and I am honored to be joined by special guests who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. So join us on this adventure where we speak candidly about the topics that matter most and challenge some of society's most common biases so that we may grow together. Let's get started. I am so lucky and honored to have our first special guest joining us today. His name is Eldra Jackson III. Eldra, could you share a little bit about yourself and what you bring to the discussion?
A little bit about myself. Okay, well, I am what I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. In for to put bread and meat on the table, my vocation is executive director of a nonprofit organization that is California based that goes by the name of Inside Circle. And what we
Awesome.
do is provide spaces that have been affectionately referred to as healing circles.
That's awesome. Awesome. So, today we're going to be talking a little bit about those who have experienced incarceration, some of the cycles we've seen within the systems, and what have you kind of witnessed, whether firsthand or through your own experiences, that you feel could really change within society's perception on those that have been incarcerated.
What have I seen? Well, a common thread that I have seen, and I'm going to preface this by saying that when I mention this, I don't mention it as an excuse or a reason. I mention it as an ingredient. A common thread
Mm-hmm.
that I have seen that runs amongst folks that either are incarcerated or who have been affected by incarceration is trauma. And
Yeah.
often that trauma is related to childhood experiences. I'm certain, a lot of people that might be interested in listening to this podcast are familiar with the ACEs scores or the
Yeah.
adverse childhood experiences. And folks that are incarcerated, studies have shown, over 60% of people who are incarcerated have four or more
Yeah.
ACE factors on the basic 10. Now, the ACE score has been expanded beyond the basic 10, but on the basic 10, most folks who have been incarcerated have four or more of those experiences. So that is one of the common threads that I have seen in that population, and something that I believe society can help with in that is looking at and collectively taking a more concern and care of the mental and emotional well-being of our children.
Absolutely. It starts there, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So, understanding that as children, people are exposed to various circumstances, what kind of forms in the beliefs and perspectives that you have seen that stems from we have the ACEs scores, we know the studies and the statistics are out there. What kind of internal dialogue or beliefs come about after some of those experiences that kind of also are an ingredient leading people into incarceration?
What are some of the things? Well, again, I'm certain that most folks that would be listening to this are familiar with some of the what I call pop culture terms now, like
Yeah.
a self talk and the self narrative. What is the story that I'm telling myself? What are the voices that I'm hearing about my experiences? And in the work that I do and the experience that I have, as an individual and in sitting with people, oftentimes as young folks, as a result of these experiences, stories are formed and narratives are created, at a very young and tender age. It can be, I've seen as young as 2 years old, folks can remember a traumatic experience and then beginning to develop an understanding or belief about themselves, other people, and the way that the world is and how the world sees them. And no one 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old is capable or competent or should be put in a position to make decisions and resolve around what their place is in the world and how the world sees them. And unfortunately, that carries on oftentimes throughout adulthood unchecked. And that those are the sorts of things that can contribute to an individual making decisions that the general public would deem to be antisocial.
What do you feel society's responsibility is in order to kind of promote more healing spaces and actual rehabilitation versus cyclic incarceration?
What is society's responsibility? Well, I my experience is that folks in society want to be safe. Folks in
Hmm.
society want to feel protected. Folks in society want to be seen, heard, and loved. And
Yeah.
so, if with that being the case, if I want that for myself, it makes sense that I want that for others. And especially, our most vulnerable in society. And I don't know if there's anyone in our society more vulnerable than children. And so, taking a collective inventory and a collective stance around what we expose children to, how we treat children, how we communicate with young people, and how we support their blossoming into human
Hmm.
beings. What is it that we're teaching them? Sending children to school and teaching them how to recite the ABCs and how to count to 100,
Hmm.
is useful. And there's an emotional intelligence piece that
Yeah.
unfortunately we do not focus on. Teaching human beings how to recognize their emotions, how to be in relationship with their emotions, and how to be in relationship with other people when it comes to dealing with their emotions. Those are not skills that we collectively promote, fostering in young people and in human beings in general.
Yeah, it's something I think most of society we're uncomfortable with, right? Because it can be that fear of weakness or perception of weakness and vulnerability that people generally feel like puts them at risk. So,
Yeah.
absolutely. What are some of the barriers you see people coming out of prison face when they're re-entering society that we can also try to address?
Some of the barriers that I have seen, I mean, well, number one obvious barrier is to employment. There
Hmm.
are barriers to housing. There is a stigma attached to being what they refer to as an ex-felon or an ex-con. And then there is the again the emotional piece. If we're not creating a space while an individual is incarcerated to to rehabilitate and or heal, then an individual can come out still damaged. An individual could come out
Yeah.
still dealing with emotional and psychological issues. And again, the narrative and the story that I could be
Mhm.
telling myself is that as I'm walking down the street, everybody who sees me knows I just got out of prison. Even though nobody is thinking that, nobody knows
Mhm.
unless I open my mouth and I
Yeah.
say so. The story that I'm telling myself and the belief that I have is that everybody knows, and every interaction that I have, that can be playing in the back of my head, and I can believe that any interaction that my ego feels is negative is because
Mhm.
I'm an ex-con. It's because I'm an ex-felon, and so there's bias here, and so that can create a whole a cycle of devolving into depression and all sorts of other things that can once again, unfortunately, lead to what we see as high rates of recidivism.
It's almost that identity prolongs the cycle, right? But then that perspective that everyone views that as my identity before we have the chance, it keeps that cycle going.
Yeah, folks are familiar with the term imposter syndrome, and
Hmm.
that can be overlaid on the question that you just asked, people coming out can have that imposter syndrome, feeling like they don't belong in society, feeling like they are not a
Mhm.
citizen, feeling like they're not a civilian, and I've seen where folks struggle with that.
Absolutely. That kind of taps into some of the post-incarceration syndrome
Hmm.
symptomology that a lot of us see or encounter, where it's this like separation from society and what society is now versus maybe what it was like when people first went in.
Hmm.
Absolutely. So I know you've spoken pretty candidly about your experiences in the past. With that, and you're working with the Inside Circle, you're working within different organizations. What was kind of a pivotal point in your own healing journey and change that stands out to you?
A pivotal point for me is, I was just talking about this the other day, is when I was adopted by Inside Circle, and I was sitting in one of the sessions, and one of the elder facilitators asked me who I was. And in asking me who I was, I had several answers, and they were all very topical. They were all very, shallow. My
Yeah.
nickname and where I'm from, what gang I claim, different things like that. And none of the answers that I was prepared to give had any depth. None of the answers that I was prepared to give identified parts of me at my core, at my being. That wasn't something that I was in touch with. That wasn't something that I was in tune with, and that was very humbling, and put me in touch with a deep sense of shame. That
Mm.
at in my late 20s, early 30s, I had no clue who I was. I couldn't, stand with somebody that I looked at as a grown man and have a conversation about who I was. And that for me was like, well, damn, I need to figure out who the hell I am.
Yeah. To be able to then verbalize it, right? Because half of it is being able to verbalize what we think about ourselves with our own expectations, because we carry so many biases about ourselves that it's hard to acknowledge that, oh, this person's maybe calling me out on the way I need, but it's awesome that they were someone you respected so dearly, because it sounds like that really broke through that barrier.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
So, how can we cultivate places of healing instead of institutions which perpetuate further trauma? Because I know you
Mm.
mentioned more mental health focus and whatnot, but addressing the institutions that are currently already established and set up, what can we do within those?
Within the systems that are currently present, well, I believe that it starts with the understanding and recognizing that we're all human beings, and recognizing that anybody who is connected to present systems the way that they're currently constituted, whether there's somebody who's going through the system or somebody who works in the system, everybody involved is a human being. And it can be very
Yeah.
easy to go into a sense of othering and beginning to see, people as something outside of this shared humanity. And
Yeah.
it can be very easy in the moment to sensationalize or to demonize or to categorize someone based on a choice, no matter how slight the choice may have been or how grotesque and gruesome the choice may have been. It's a moment in time in a human's experience. And
Yeah.
when I think about my own life, I definitely don't want to be judged not by other human beings, by what may have been the worst moment in my life, the worst choice in my life, or series of choices in my life, because fortunately or unfortunately, I was caught and held accountable, for my poor choices. There are a lot of folks who have not been in that same situation and have made some choices that I'm certain they would not like to see come to the light of day. And they
Hmm.
definitely would not want the entirety of who they are to be based on that moment in time. So just having a little bit of capacity to understand, that human beings are fallible, Human beings, make, I'll use the word mistakes and poor choices. And that's not to say
Mhm.
that human beings, that I should be absolved when I make a poor choice. I
Mhm.
should be held accountable. There should be consequences. And I am a human being, as you are a human being. And where do we get to a place where we start to think about making each other whole, making the community whole?
Mhm.
How can I, as a victimizer, contribute to making folks who I have victimized? How can I be a part of the process where they and the community can become whole? And how can I
Mhm.
myself become whole? Because sooner or later, we're all going to be in one another's presence. Again, 95% of folks that are incarcerated, that are sent away, will return back to the community. Not everybody goes away
Absolutely.
for life. Not everybody goes to death row. So who do we
Yeah.
want coming back? What sort of folks, what sort of healing, what sort of level of mental and emotional well-being do we want people returning back to our communities?
Absolutely. You hit on a really key point of that double standard that we carry of, well, I haven't been caught for my things and I'm going to keep my dirty laundry down, but society goes, oh, you've been caught, so let's do the firmest and strictest punishment we can deem, and then we kind of turn a blind eye. So
Hmm.
a big part of Reframe to Reform's kind of mission is looking at how do we change that perspective, and you're tapping into that core of we're human. Every
Hmm.
single one of us is human and we have dignity and worth, and that really doesn't go away behind prison doors. So,
Hmm.
can you speak on some of what went on in the prisons you were involved in, whether it was from the treatment of those around you, from the staff? Did you see kind of a mixture? Because we're talking about the dehumanization component, and I want to tap into more to where we can bring awareness on what does go on with that.
Oh, so I've seen both sides, and so I don't want to get off into making the system, just
Mm-hmm.
horrendous and bad and everybody involved in it is horrible, because that's not the case.
Nope.
Again, folks that, everybody, that's a part of the system are human. And I've run across in the system some very unique and heartfelt individuals who are champions of souls,
Mm-hmm.
and are there, to really be of assistance. And, dealing with humanity, I've seen some of the worst. I've done some of the worst things that a human being can do,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen and experienced some of the worst things that a human being can do. And unfortunately, it has been in some carceral settings, and the dehumanization begins, at the point of arrest.
Yeah.
So you don't have to think about somebody going all the way, into the prison system. It begins at the point of arrest, and it starts with the chaining and shackling of a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And we could argue, back and forth for days about safety and security and those sorts of things. And the reality is, we're talking about, chaining and shackling, human beings, and all of the mental and emotional pieces that can come, from that. And then you get into processing someone into the jail system. When you process someone into the jail system, it involves there's a stripping, and it's
Mm-hmm.
both literal and it is symbolic and figurative. And
Yes.
there is a stripping of the clothes in order to,
Mm-hmm.
search for contraband and make certain that nothing is being introduced into a secure setting and environment that's, supposed to be sterile. And so you're stripping somebody down completely naked, and you have the visual of that, but the mental aspect and the emotional
Mm-hmm.
aspect of that is the beginning of stripping away rights, the beginning of stripping away humanity, the beginning of stripping away dignity. There's a lot that is a
Absolutely.
part of that experience, and
Mm-hmm.
so everyone who goes through, the jail experience goes through that initiation
Mm.
of being stripped of who they are, being stripped of everything. and it can go on from there. We could get off into brutality around beatings and things like that. I think there's enough of that out there. But if we just start right there, and if that's where we stopped, around the stripping of the humanity and the stripping of the dignity and those sorts of things, I mean, that is excuse my French, that's a fucked up experience for anybody to have to go through. And then having, your orifices checked and inspected, and it can be, I know as a man what it feels like. I can't even begin to imagine, what girls, young ladies, females, and women would feel, going through that sort of experience.
Absolutely. And I think the symbolism, right? Because we're talking about autonomy of the human existence, and then that autonomy being taken away based on one action or a couple actions, right? Those fallacies we're describing. And then it's that ripple effect. Well, this has already happened, and that perpetuation of it continues because also that belief gets gradually formed and stronger. Absolutely.
It leads into it leads into, if I strip you of your humanity, then you are less than human. You are now subhuman. You are beneath a human being. And so if I begin to believe that I'm less than human, if I begin to believe that I'm subhuman, then what do I have that will keep me from reacting from a place of subhumanity or less than humanity, and beginning to take that on and adopt that as an identity and as a way of being?
That primitive evolution, right? So going back into the primitive behaviors, whether it's for self-preservation, whether for its connection, because a lot of times we see these extreme primitive behaviors come out, and it's really people wanting connection, but communicating that isn't effective in the same way anymore in that situation. But I think absolutely you're getting some of the key points both within those internal beliefs, and then it helps the staff and those around. And I agree with you, it is not at all everyone. There are people that stand strong and work to avoid the jadedness, but it's almost an ingredient of how do we become further jaded. If I say they're not human anymore, right, then I can do the next step and I can continue on with the tasks I'm made to do basically in those systems.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a flip side to that. When you talk about connecting to the ability to, see someone as less than human, which allows me to go to a place where I can treat them, in particular ways that I might not ordinarily in other situations treat another human being. There's trauma there, for the folks that
Yes.
work in those environments. And so now, if I'm a correctional officer and I've been, trained to treat people in a particular way, and I begin to adopt that and find a way to rationalize that, that is stuff that they are carrying inside of their body. That's trauma that they're carrying inside of their body, and then going out into the world and going home to their families, and more than likely not having a healthy place to decompress and to debrief this trauma. And so that's held in, and it can show up in very unhealthy ways, unfortunately, for correctional staff and folks that work in these
Yeah.
positions. And I don't know if a lot of people know, but the average life expectancy for folks that work in those settings is 55 years old.
Wow.
And that number generally falls about within the range of within 5 years of retirement.
Wow. Yeah. So this long trajectory of all these work and these days that you're putting in, and then knowing that's a high turnover outcome. Absolutely. You are describing hypervigilance on both sides, right? So the people that are in charge of keeping those people in the system safe are presenting with this extreme hypervigilance where they're on edge, right? Reactionary, or trying to prevent reactions they're assuming will happen, right? And they're tasked with trying to protect others. But on the flip side, we have this balance of neither sounds like they feel safe. And when you're in that environment nonstop, it absolutely takes a toll on the brain and how you interpret things when you're in society, when you're with your family, when you're with your loved ones. So it's creating this dichotomy of it's a cycle on both ends. How do we
Yeah.
break that?
Yeah, I think we begin to break that. I'm partial, to what we do. I'm partial to circle, and to break it down and make it, super easy. Checking in with each other, checking in with one
Yeah.
another, and I mean, honestly and realistically, and from a place of openness and real heart, checking in. Like, hey, Callie, how are you doing today?
Yeah.
And when I say that, not coming from a place of this is just the societal norm of I'm saying it, and the expectation or the belief from you is that I'm going to say, oh, I'm doing fine, everything is okay, and then we move right
It's all
along because this
good.
is just what we do. When that's not the case, when you're really, struggling with something, and you're dealing with something, and things are going on at work, and things are going on at home, and on the ride into work, these different things that are existing within your nervous system. Sometimes it's cathartic just simply to have a place to say it, to expel
Yeah.
it. Almost like dogs when they get wet or they have an interaction, and then they move, a couple of feet away from the interaction, and then they shake, to get rid of it, and then they move on, and it's gone. So just
Yeah.
having, a space to be able to shake that off, to settle and ground and be present and then move on, can make a world of difference.
Yeah. It's that compassion and connection on both sides
Hmm.
and showing that we don't have to be at odds with each other, right? Because realistically, those that are in the systems working, you should be serving the populations you're working with. That's my opinion, right? That's my own biased opinion as well. But understanding when we talk about these children initially, this transformation, these beliefs that get developed, it's still the same vulnerable population. They're just grown up, right?
Hmm.
Society doesn't view them with the same compassion
Yeah.
and what's the term I'm looking for? Not just compassion, but just perspective anymore. We become harsher to each other, it seems like, within, I mean, decades and decades with hyper vigilance.
Yeah.
What changes have you witnessed firsthand within the systems, and can you speak on people's ability to recover, evolve, and grow? Because I would imagine you've gotten to experience that firsthand, and I know that that could be really profound.
Yeah. The changes, excuse me, some of the changes that I have seen in the system are, I want to say, in the last 5, 6 years, and this is in several jurisdictions across the country, from California, because that's where we're mainly based, to New Jersey. We do a lot of work in the juvenile systems in New Jersey. And the biggest shift that I have seen is the willingness of staff and the leaders of correctional institutions to engage in these healing circles themselves,
Oh, wow.
both separately as correctional staff, but more importantly with those folks that they are charged with keeping inside. And in doing that, what I have seen is a space be created and communities be created where individuals can see each other, where folks who are incarcerated can see, their jailers, and see them as people, and recognize that, they have a job to do and they're just there to do a job. And, the jailers, or the folks that are in charge of custody, have the opportunity to see the folks that are in their care and custody as human beings, and recognize what they're going through, and some of the things that they're going through, and some of the stressors that are present in their lives outside of just being incarcerated.
Yeah.
And so there's an understanding and a mutual respect and a different way of being in that environment. Okay, we both have to be here, and it doesn't have to be miserable for either one of us.
Yeah, we can have dignity, right? We can treat each
Yes.
other with dignity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's really
Yeah.
cool. What's their resistance? Because I'm I'm fascinated with that concept of the co-occurring. Was there resistance with rolling that out, or where that rolled out pretty open to it?
There are places where there's resistance because we're talking about centuries of systems and ways of being, and the general belief, the general way of doing business is that, okay, you're over there and I'm over here. You're a convict, I'm a guard. You're a prisoner, you're an inmate, I'm a correctional officer. Those sorts of mentalities, because they have these things called over familiarity. You don't get over familiar. Either side, you don't share personal information. All of these things that are built in to keep massive walls built up
Yeah.
and to keep the space and the propagating the ability to see each other as others and less
The
than
power and
human.
control.
And so,
Yeah.
finding a way to create a space that is safe and accommodating, knowing that these are built in and generational beliefs and ways of being. How do we hold that? How do we be, safe? How do we protect one another
Yeah.
and still be in relationship and be in community and see each other? So, the biggest piece, it really is the old paradigms of what the system is, and breaking that down and transforming it or transmuting it into something that works for, a shared sense of humanity.
Absolutely. The coexisting, but also trying to help one another thrive, because there's so much opposition within the beliefs and dynamics surrounding it. And I can look inwardly and acknowledge that from some of my firsthand experiences. But we have to kind of challenge those biases that we all carry if we want to move forward. And it's not easy. I know you know that.
No, it's not easy, when you have folks that say go through academies and, they're being trained and things are being drilled in them day in and day out. Like, hey, these folks are bad. These folks are horrible. They're evil. At every opportunity, they're going to try and take advantage of you. They're looking to get something from you, keep them at a distance. That all of those sorts of things is being drilled into you, so you begin to take that as normal. And on the other side, it's being drilled in that the cops are bad. They're horrible. They're out to lynch you. They're evil. They're the Gestapo. All of these sorts of
Yeah.
things. And so there's a lot of stuff to overcome to meet in the middle and see and
Yeah.
find where there's shared humanity and where there are shared experiences, because until we sit down at the table and talk, we can't find those shared experiences. We can't find that shared humanity. I can't see you if
Yeah.
I can't see you. If we can't sit down together and break bread and talk, and I can learn a little bit about your experience, again, not about your personal life. I want your your address and where your kids go to school and the number to your bank account, not that. But where's your humanity? Can I see your humanity? Can I show you my humanity? Can I show you where I hurt? Can I show you where I have joy? Can you show me the same?
Yeah. So how do we break those defenses down to be able to sit at that table?
We come up with the courage to sit at the table and open up and tell the
Just
truth.
do it.
That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It
It's
doesn't
just that
matter where I
simple.
go and who it's with, what the environment is. It's just that simple. Sit down and tell the truth.
And listen for the truth. Right.
Even if the truth is, I don't like the way you look. Okay,
Yep.
well we can look at that, and that's
Yeah.
what you think and that's what you feel. Okay, and where does that come
Hmm.
from? What
Yeah.
informs that? We can start to dig in and dissect where some of these beliefs come from, where some of this stuff comes from, and hold up a mirror and kind of get outside, of that matrix and look at it from other aspects and look at it from other angles. And when I look at it from other angles, I might, see that, that's not really what I believe. That's what I was taught to believe. That's something somebody
Yeah.
gave me. That's something that somebody
Mhm.
inherited. I inherited that, but I don't really believe that. So what is it that I do believe? What is it that I do feel?
What do you see helping people cultivate their own beliefs? Because I know in the circles you've shared how we tend to have groupthink, right? And unless we have these
Hmm.
firsthand experiences, sometimes we don't break away from that groupthink. So, what do you
Hmm.
think will help challenge that kind of norm in society?
I think I don't think I know the greatest tool in beginning to challenge those sorts of norms is if I say something, you asking me, okay, well, where does that come from? Where did you form that?
Mm.
Questioning one another, creating spaces where it's okay, for you to ask me questions and for me to ask you questions. Because not only will
Yeah.
that help me to better understand you,
Mhm.
it creates a space for you to better understand yourselves. Because sometimes, human beings are going on autopilot and they're just reciting things that, have been put into them, information that's been fed to them. And if I don't have the space to stop and think for myself, where does this come from? Is this something that I really believe? How true is this for me? Then I'll just continue on down the line.
What's amazing is you're describing freedom, right?
Hmm.
When we look at that, you're describing if I have the ability to actually be free in myself, then I am willing to go there in these conversations to identify what is true to me and what's not.
Hmm.
And that's so uncomfortable, right?
Yes,
It's
it can be.
uncomfortable. But it's powerful, and I think as a reminder for those who are coming out of the systems when it feels like power has been taken from them, as a reminder, our mind has so much power that we can pull from in our own
Yep.
autonomy in ways that we often we discount. We kind of throw
Yes.
it away and say, no, that's not true freedom, but we're kind of breaking down to the core of that, of that's what it means to be human and get to decide what I believe and what I think about this.
Yes.
So, in the spirit of what you just said, do you have any
Okay.
questions for me? Right? I gotta open it up as a dialogue.
Yeah. So, what is it that got us to the place where we're having this conversation today? What is the inspiration? What is the motivation? What is the drive for you behind the work that you're engaging in to get this word out?
So, I think at the core of it, I've witnessed extreme human suffering for the brief period that I did work within the systems, as well as I've just had this long term innate belief about there's a point in my life where I decided kind of just looking at career paths. Where am I going to go with myself? And it became clear that I could either think economically of, hey, I've got to focus on the numbers and what works for like the grand gestures and all that, or I can break it down and see people as human. And I kind of just made a mental choice and said, I'm going to see people as human and let that be my guide for the path I choose in my career and my goals. And then on that further level, working within certain systems where people were struggling with mental health concerns on the kind of extremes, whether it was psychosis, whether it was withdrawals, whether it was homicidal ideations, this anger that was really fear, because that's what I saw it more so as.
Hmm.
It's this fear of people coming into the system and having, like you're saying, being stripped, right? And then realizing that I was working within a system that assisted in that stripping due to the limitations of the system, right? You can justify it all day long, but I know how it made my morals feel and my compass feel, even if it was with the intent to protect. It was recognizing that people don't talk about this enough. People don't see this. When they don't see it, they don't have to address it or acknowledge that it's going on. And seeing the profound impact it had on myself, but on the people that I was serving, and then seeing the amount of jadedness, and it was really self-preservation in the field, but I saw that from my colleagues, and that was incredibly disheartening for me because we were the carers, right? We were the ones that were supposed to provide the support, but it was also that way of I have to make it through the day. So for me, it became this mission of how do I bring awareness to this? Because if you don't firsthand see it, a lot of people just don't believe it's going on.
Yeah.
And the things I witnessed at times were people stripped of their clothing in concrete cells with a crate on the floor. That was what they were in, and the environment we were supposed to be in was supposed to be the safe place. And when you have people coming into that safe shared space asking you, hey, I needed help, I was asking for help, why am I in the hole? That's a profound impact of you're not in the hole, but I know why it feels that way. And I can't really do anything to make it not feel that way. So this is kind of that step of what can we do to change that in the future.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. And you asked the question, how do we begin to get to that place? It's just like this, having conversations just like this.
Yeah.
And just sitting down and telling the truth.
Yeah.
That's called being human.
Yeah. Right? We all have lessons we still need to learn. We all have growth that we're still working towards. I hope we can kind of cultivate the dialogue ongoing of what can we do to further support one another, because at the core, we're still just people. And it's, yeah, the system takes such a
We're
toll.
people, and it doesn't matter where I go around the world. We all want the same thing. We don't all necessarily communicate it to each other in the same way, but we all want the same thing.
Which is,
We all want love.
yeah.
And inside of that love, you can break down, to different parts of the tree. In that love, everybody wants safety. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to be understood.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I have yet to run into a human being that doesn't want those things.
Yeah, that's very true. They might deny it, right? They might deny it initially, but you can see through it. You can see that
Yeah.
that's absolutely what it is. Are there any lessons learned or final thoughts that you would like people to know and understand about this mission and kind of what you're also working towards?
So lessons learned, I would say, are it's super important to love self, because when I'm truly in relationship with myself, when I truly love myself, I can tap into the capacity to really love and care about others. And
Yeah.
until I do that within myself, I really don't have the authentic capacity to do that and be with others. And so that is, something that I would leave folks with, is to really learn and focus and commit to being in relationship with self. And yeah, that's the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway that I have from this work. And I guess I'd like folks to know that one of the big things that we're doing is, and we'll really be focusing on it internally and communicating externally to folks, is a campaign to develop and open up a healing home and training academy. A
That's
place for
awesome.
folks to come and sit and really debrief and decompress, in making their transition back out into the community, so that they have a space to sit and be in circle. And we will be bringing, folks from around the world that we've been in community with, to come and train as facilitators to take this work back to, the parts of the globe in which they're in, so that this medicine and love can spread.
That's amazing. I look forward to seeing that and all that you get to work through and accomplish. And I thank you so much for spending time with me today and kind of going into some of the topics that I think matter most for this goal.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Anytime I get the opportunity to sit with a human and just be, that's where I'm supposed
Yeah,
to be.
absolutely. Well, thank you.